Hey folks, thanks very much for tuning in, as always, much appreciated. Welcome back, and if you are new to the channel, hello, thanks very much for joining. Please subscribe if you like this kind of jazz. Let's get into the story. So I don't actually know how I missed this. This information was actually hot off the presses last month, but I suppose it is better late than never. Basically, television's favourite, friendly, cuddly uncle, maybe a bit overly cuddly, the media darling that is Phillip Schofield, the nicest man in showbiz until a few months ago, has only gone and released a book. And it's an autobiography, no less, so the story of his life as written by him. Now, this book is called Life's What You Make It, which I think is a good name for a book which seems to be about damage control. Maybe a better title would be Life's What You Tell People It Is, and the media will take care of the rest. But joking aside, I did wonder if this life story of Phillip Schofield, this so-called tell-all autobiography, actually told all, at least about certain things. I wondered if it was missing anything out perhaps, such as the fact that his lover, 30 odd years younger than him, was someone that he was photographed with when the lover was 10, allegedly. So I'm going to go over this again, just in case you haven't seen my other Schofield video or if you haven't heard on the grapevine. And there are a couple of more points as well that do need to be clarified and some new information too. Now, I'm sure many of you listening are aware of the little whirlwind of gossip surrounding Phillip Schofield. Certainly if you lived in the UK about 10 or so months ago, you'll no doubt recall that Phillip Schofield came out to much fanfare in the media and announced that he's gay. This appeared to me and many other people to be very sudden, basically a knee-jerk reaction to media pressure, because prior to him coming out, we'd had several weeks of negative stories about Schofield building up in the press. It was just gossip type stuff. It was things saying that he was nasty, the kind of thing that I said in my last video that we saw with Ellen DeGeneres in the US, stories saying that he was really hard to work with, that he was unpleasant and unkind, and basically that he was just a big meanie. And obviously that is not news to me, certainly not newsworthy. And it didn't seem particularly right, all this negative press from different sources. It seemed that there was something else going on. So I wanted to know what was going on and had a little look around, and obviously I found out that he'd been having an affair with a junior member of staff called Matthew, allegedly. This affair was outed by various sources after Phillip Schofield came out on the same day, or certainly in the days after he came out. There were people from ITV, staff at ITV, who'd had messages leaked that were talking about this affair with a runner, and this runner turned out to be this guy called Matthew. So Phillip Schofield, a powerful TV legend in the UK, had allegedly been having sex with this junior member of staff, this guy Matthew, and then something happened whereby the relationship broke down, as you would probably expect with an age gap of that size, with Matthew being born in the mid-1990s and Phillip Schofield being born in the early 1960s. Phillip's actually 34 years older than Matthew. With an age gap of that size, you'd expect something to potentially not last. Not unheard of for an age gap of that size to be a successful relationship, but it's no surprise to anyone that that broke down. So allegedly, Matthew threatened to go public with the story, and he'd signed a deal with a newspaper. Basically, he was going to tell everyone that he and Phillip were engaged in sexual relations, apparently, and appeared that that's what pushed Phillip Schofield into coming out as gay. All well and good. Tabloid story, I suppose. Somebody was going to out a famous TV presenter in the papers by selling their own story. I don't think the intention was to out Phillip Schofield as such. The intention was for this Matthew guy to actually have his story told. He wanted to tell his story and obviously get paid for it due to, presumably, the way he'd been treated by Schofield. But upon scratching beneath the surfaces of those claims that it was just an affair with a runner that was going to come out, it became clear that there was a little bit more to it than that, a little bit more than met the eye. Now, what we do know is that this Matthew guy, he joined a kids' theatre school when he was believed to be around 10 years old, and Phillip Schofield was a man in his mid-40s at that point. He was the patron of that theatre school, one of the patrons, a famous patron. There's a photograph showing Phillip standing with a group of children at the school, and Matthew is one of the children in that group with Phillip. I personally find the juxtaposition between the two of them quite uncomfortable viewing, knowing that they allegedly went on to become lovers. That's the word on the ITV grapevine. It does need to be made extremely clear, however, that there's been no accusations of wrongdoing, in the sense that we don't even know if Phillip Schofield spoke to Matthew at this time, during this time period. Although it would seem unusual if one of the famous patrons turned up and didn't speak to the kids that he was posing with for a photograph. That would be strange if he just turned up and then ignored them all. But anyway, there's no suggestion that they had any kind of contact at that time. But when we fast forward 5 years, there are screenshots that show Phillip Schofield following this Matthew guy on Twitter. And this was, I believe, 5 days after Matthew had turned 15. So around 5 years after the theatre school photographs, Phillip Schofield has apparently reached out to this boy on social media, and the boy excitedly replies, "Thanks for following me." Presumably he would have been quite ecstatic to have been noticed by the famous TV star Phillip Schofield. Now keep in mind, this is an important point, Matthew had not asked Phillip to follow him. It wasn't like he was getting pestered by Matthew saying, "Please follow me." Not in this case. Matthew did make accounts later on, different Twitter accounts later on, where he did reach out to Phillip and ask him to follow him. But in this case, Phillip Schofield followed Matthew without any request from Matthew to follow him. And like I say, this happened a few days after Matthew turned 15. Less than 2 months after suddenly following Matthew on Twitter, Phillip Schofield returned to the theatre school, the Two-Faced Theatre School, where Matthew was still a student and Phillip was still the patron. So he followed Matthew on Twitter just after Matthew turned 15, and less than 2 months later, about 6 weeks later, Phillip Schofield turned up to the Two-Faced Theatre School for a visit. It's not known if they met each other there or if Phillip saw Matthew there. So Matthew then sent Phillip Schofield quite a lot of messages, atted him a few times, various tweets basically. Like I say, he was probably over the moon to have Phillip Schofield following him. This guy wanted to get into TV, and this is obviously a very exciting thing, especially for a young boy. But Phillip did not reply to any of Matthew's messages. He followed him on Twitter unprompted, but he did not interact with Matthew on Twitter. At some point, Matthew made another account. As I said, he would have been about 16 at that point, and then he asked Phillip to follow that account, which Phillip did. And again, he did not interact with him on Twitter at all otherwise. So he's followed him on Twitter when he was 15. He's refollowed his second account when he was 16. But he still hasn't contacted him at all out in the open. And we don't know if he contacted him behind the scenes either. But then 9 days after Matthew turned 18, Phillip Schofield began to speak to him on Twitter. Openly. That's when the messages between the two of them began on Twitter. Now, there are screenshots purporting to show Phillip Schofield speaking to all kinds of different young adults and youngsters on Snapchat. I'm not going to include these here. I'm not sure whether they're particularly relevant to this story at all or whether they just make things a bit murky, but apparently Phillip Schofield does speak to regular guys and young ones as well on Snapchat. He certainly was during this time period, according to some of the screenshots that are supposedly out there, but I'll just say that those may well all be hearsay. Anyway, so Phillip Schofield follows Matthew after Matthew turns 18. Again, it was just a few days after his birthday. Then Matthew got invited onto their show by Phillip Schofield. So still 18 years old. And it's at that point that the sexual relationship is alleged to have begun. So basically, Phillip Schofield started talking to Matthew 9 days after Matthew turned 18, and then when Matthew was still 18, he was invited onto the set of This Morning with Phillip Schofield, And then at some point they supposedly got into a relationship. It's said to have happened when Matthew was 18. However, because neither of them are actually coming out about it, so to speak, we actually can't really confirm that, but it's certainly said that they got into a relationship. And this is according to people in the industry who made comments on social media about it in February. So that's the supposed timeline. They start speaking, they meet on the set of the TV show, and they allegedly start sleeping together at some point. This was after Phillip Schofield had followed Matthew twice on Twitter in the preceding years, from when he was aged 15 years old. And he was also the patron of the theatre school where Matthew had been a student since he was aged 10, and they'd been in the same room when Matthew was aged 10. That much is documented photographically. There are gaps in the timeline, and there have been no accusations that there were any incidents or any evidence of contact between the two of them during those gaps, so people shouldn't just go and fill in the gaps. But that is the timeline, based on what we know. Now, they were apparently together for a few years by the looks of things, and this was behind Philip's wife's back, it must have been, unless she knew about it. And then they apparently fell out, and Matthew apparently went to the media. Then Phillip Schofield came out, and apparently a superinjunction kicked in to prevent the media running specific stories mentioning Matthew. Although the media was obviously allowed to run what I could only describe as nearly ceremonious stories about Phillip Schofield coming out. It was basically centre spreads of Phillip Schofield's royal coming out extravaganza. It was like a royal wedding. Craziest thing I've ever seen almost. In 2020 especially, when nobody cares if someone's gay. And they really did keep the focus on, this is what it's about, this is what it's about Phillip Schofield being gay, this is it, he's come out, this is the story is that Phillip Schofield's gay, that's the story, keep your eyes here. That was certainly my impression anyway. Trying to keep us focused on one point that interested nobody. Then we had a small worldwide incident which shut everything down, and that put a convenient end to all the media stories, and there's been a media blackout on any mention of Matthew. So now we fast forward to now, and the general point of this video, which is the book, the tell-all autobiography. Now, the worst part of this whole story so far might actually be that I ended up having to buy the book. I had heard that he didn't touch the topic in the book, but I couldn't really do this video until I'd seen for myself what he'd actually written. So that is a bit disappointing that I now own the book. I got the audio version, so at least it's not cluttering up my home. So I suppose that is one blessing. All I can say from the parts that I've listened to is that it is sickeningly self-indulgent. I did go into this with an open mind. I would like to have heard something very interesting and well explained and expressed, but nope, it was extremely self-indulgent. He says, for example, that he is seen as some kind of torchbearer. He says people have told him that he saved them from suicide. It's possible. He calls himself so honest. He literally expects us to believe that strangers have stopped him in the street and told him he's moved the country forward a step or two, and then thrown their arms around him. He says a journalist who had been hating on him called him and told him that he's advanced the cause by 10 years. He actually says that. He says that that's what a journalist did. Phoned him up and said, "You've advanced the cause by 10 years, Philip." I think it's up to the reader to infer what the cause is, because he doesn't actually say. But the book's full of stuff like this, as well as these dramatic flourishes that probably didn't happen in real life. The opening part of the book is about how he kept a pre-shaken can of Coca-Cola in the shop that he worked in, so that he could sell it to rude customers who asked for Coca-Cola. Just a pre-prepared shaken can. And then apparently he would watch them walk down onto the busy beach outside, and he would see where they ended up sitting down, because when they opened the can, the fountain of cola that spewed out of the can was so high and rose so far above the heads of the crowd that he could see it from where he worked in the shop. Apparently he did this all the time. So he lived in some kind of cartoon. A total mischievous little scamp. That's what he's trying to get across. But yes, I didn't believe that. Not the way it was written anyway. but you can tell from the offset that Phillip Schofield is really, really into Phillip Schofield. He actually does think he's great. And of course, there is nothing wrong with that, but I just don't want to listen to him indulge himself like that. So I skipped ahead, trying to find the part that I was looking for, and I couldn't find it. I did eventually find it. Out of 15 chapters, he finally addresses this in chapter 14, which is fair enough because it did just happen recently, but nobody will be surprised to know that he's not included Matthew in the book. But one thing that is quite interesting and surprising is that he said quite clearly that there's no superinjunction. He says in the book that any talk of a superinjunction is bollocks. That's what he actually says. Now, another interesting thing he says is that people who don't follow the mainstream press are sheep. He says anyone that gets their news from alternative sources is a sheep going where they're led and bleating out fake news on cue. He says to the reader, get your news from reliable sources, for example the mainstream press, and don't be a sheep. Now he does address the rumours ever so slightly. He says he was not forced to come out as gay, despite the rumours you may have heard. He says that he knew he was gay 5 years ago, which coincidentally is alleged to be when he first got into a relationship with Matthew, around about that time, yet he didn't mention him in the book. In fact, the way he's written the book, you'd get the impression that he's realised he's gay, but he's decided to remain celibate in that regard, and remains happily married to his extremely supportive wife. One quote that I did promise that I wouldn't make fun of in this video was when Phillip says that he had a particularly difficult conversation with his wife, who at that point knew he was gay, and he said that he felt he'd fallen into a crack. I can certainly imagine that that would have been a difficult conversation to have with your wife, Phillip. But Phillip Schofield's book is just a massively egotistical exercise in self-congratulation. It leads up to him being a brave hero of the gay community and his story of realising that he was gay, despite not acting on it and coming out to the masses, with absolutely no pressure from outside influences whatsoever, and no mention of the young runner mentioned by so many different sources when he came out. So it would seem that Phillip suggests the massive amount of worry, including prescription pill usage, missing work, and the massive weight loss. Apparently he went down to 9 stone. All of this just happened simply because the secret of being gay was too much and came to a head in February 2020. There was absolutely nothing else whatsoever on his mind regarding any stories that may be about to come out. Now obviously I've got no experience at all of being publicly outed as gay. I can only imagine that that would be a stressful secret to harbour if you are married with kids. But using prescription pills to take the edge off, in your own words, and dropping to 9 stone and missing work when you've actually got a job on TV, presenting a TV show, not turning up to that. This sounds like a person who was literally worried sick, actually worrying himself sick. He said he was only getting 2 hours sleep a night as well, and this is apparently all because he'd realised that he was gay. He insists that there was no story about to leak, no mention of a lover having gone to newspapers. It was all Phillip's decision, and the 7th of February 2020 was the right day for him to come out. And it's just my opinion, but to me he was obviously a very, very worried man before he came out, and to me it seems overly worried. Worried to the point that viewers, colleagues and his own mother were asking if he was ill, and apparently all this was just because he'd realised that he was gay. But now that he said that there's no superinjunction in place, I suppose it's absolutely fine to speculate, at least in our own opinions, that it seems that he was certainly more worried than one would expect, and one could speculate that he was so worried due to his connection to Matthew potentially being exposed, the connection being that he was a patron of Matthew's theatre school when Matthew was only 10, he followed Matthew on Twitter unprompted when Matthew was 15, only he'll know his decision behind that and the reasons for it, and then going to visit Matthew's theatre school less than 2 months later when Matthew was still 15, and that he finally spoke to Matthew on Twitter publicly 9 days after Matthew turned 18. Then he invited Matthew onto the set of ITV's This Morning. It was a couple of months later, and at that point, according to people who worked at ITV at the time, or shortly thereafter, he embarked on an affair with Matthew. Interestingly, that would have been around about the time that Philip claims he realised he was gay. So I would think that that would explain the depths of the worry that he was going through a little bit better than just realising that he was gay and wanting to come out about it. But it's pure speculation, and obviously I could be wrong, and that may well sound completely insensitive to a lot of people, but I don't intend to be insensitive to anyone who is struggling with coming out or anything like that. This is about Phillip Schofield and nobody else. But what Phillip Schofield has cleverly done is tried to make it into a gay issue as well. Now, it is still important to stress that there's no evidence of illegality on the part of Phillip Schofield at all, but then again, it hasn't been investigated. You would certainly expect that the police would have looked into this, if only to speak to Matthew, simply to clarify that there was no sexual activity prior to the age of him reaching at least the age of consent anyway. So there's no evidence of any illegality. I would have expected there to have been some kind of police inquiry about it, just due to the age differences and these connections that we've discussed in this video. You can't infer the nature of the connection though, but there was definitely a connection. Now, neither Philip or Matthew have confirmed or denied that a relationship even took place between the two of them, but they have been photographed together multiple times, nights out, lunches, as I say, smoking shisha together. So it's notable that Matthew doesn't actually get a mention in Philip's book. He was obviously a character in Philip's life, but didn't get a mention in the book at all. And it was also such massive news until this certain worldwide issue hit us all. It was massive news, and it was followed by a media blackout on the Schofield story. You would think that him releasing his autobiography just now you would expect it to go into a little bit of detail. He's released this autobiography at the perfect time to cash in on it, yet he only skims over the rumours. He gives us a couple of lines in the penultimate chapter. He does not address them. He acts as if he's going to address them. He starts the chapter by saying that he knows the reader may have only bought this book to hear the chapter. Oh, how right he was. And he's got no idea where to begin. Well, Philip, maybe begin by addressing the only specific rumour that anyone is actually talking about, and perhaps state explicitly that you did not have sexual relations with that man. But Philip uses the chapter to suggest that there were loads of rumours swirling around about different things. It was all very confusing, and he acts as if the rumours about him not getting on with colleagues at This Morning was the main issue, i.e. the rumours that were being published in the run-up to him coming out saying that he was mean and all this kind of stuff. He also very much bigs up his wife in this chapter and says that he had absolutely no idea he was gay when he married her, and that none of his friends had any clue that he was gay before he came out. He says he was increasingly aware that he was gay for about 5 years. He says that he's proud of himself, and all he says on the rumours regarding Matthew is that categorically he was not forced to come out. He says, and I'll quote, "I came out for me and the safety of my head. Anything you may have read, any rumours you may have heard about my hand being forced are totally untrue." That's all he says about these rumours. Now, in my opinion, that is a very cleverly written and deflective chapter, and it really muddied the waters whilst completely evading scrutiny for the alleged sexual indiscretions. At the very least, sleeping with such a very junior member of staff. It gave the impression of Phillip Schofield being open and honest, and, of course, heroic. This book has obviously netted Phillip Schofield an absolute fortune on the back of people's curiosity around the story, and he's completely milked the media firestorm that surrounded him, and he's profited handsomely from the rumours with this book, so I have to take my hat off to him for that. But it's nothing more than damage control in my opinion. It's designed to be a good easy read, maybe endearing to the right reader, written for all Schofield's fans, the people that watch This Morning, the kind of people that will go out and pepper the internet with 5-star reviews because they love him. But he's also thrown out a very definitive middle finger, a final middle finger to anyone who wanted to get closer to the truth by reading this book. I would expect that if someone else wrote a book about Phillip Schofield today, that it would be a very, very different book indeed. But because this is obviously written by him, he gets to write his own story. Life's what you make it, after all. That's what he's called his book, isn't it? And unfortunately, the damage control seems to have worked. There are very strange things going on at the moment. We've got sickly sweet, sycophantic press coverage of Schofield every single day, literally. It seems almost manufactured to rebuild his image. Certainly not news as we know it, but it is being published by these so-called reputable sources that Phillip tells us the non-sheep read. There just seems to be a concerted effort to move Phillip Schofield's reputation back into the public's favour through the use of these daily little stories that come out that are completely pointless, or they seem pointless on the surface anyway. It's the kind of thing that suggests a PR agency is still working in the background. So anyway, there you go folks, a little update on TV's favourite man. After listening to this audiobook, I'm sick of Schofield. I have learned that he's a lot more narcissistic and cunning than I would have given him credit for, but I will certainly be returning my purchase and buying something else, that's for sure. Whether there's going to be anything more coming out regarding Schofield, excuse the expression, which isn't carefully crafted PR, remains to be seen. I think he's managed to cover something up here. I stick by that, and I believe he's getting away with it. That's my opinion. I'm not suggesting he's done anything illegal, but I do believe that he's done something immoral, and from what I've seen, I don't believe that Phillip Schofield is a good man. Even if you just go by the imbalance of power in this supposed Me Too age, getting into a relationship with somebody that must have looked up to you from childhood, that you were in contact with on some level when they were at least in their teens, and then getting into a relationship with them, if that's actually true, that would have absolutely, in a right thinking company, which ITV is obviously not, it would have led to the resignation or the termination of his employment. And the lover story would definitely be out there. We're supposed to be in the hashtag Me Too age, but not in this case for some reason. I don't know why Matthew's not telling his story. It does seem very strange to me. If there's nothing untoward, even if it's not a super injunction, even if it's just a payoff, that does suggest something untoward. Anyway, that's enough Phillip Schofield today. I'll keep an eye on things. If you do like my channel, then please do subscribe, smash the like button, share the video, all that good stuff. I'll put some links down in the description as well to some of these sheep sources that Phillip warns us against looking at, and you can decide for yourself whether you're being easily led by looking at them. And just to make you aware, I also had a conversation with Wheezy from the What is Truth podcast the other day. I very much enjoyed that. Please check out Wheezy's channel in the link below. The What is Truth podcast. It's some great listening. He's really getting some good guests, big names in the field of alternative history, hypotheses and things like that. Very cool. Keep up the good work, Wheezy. Congratulations on 2k subs as well. Anyway, that's it from me folks. Thanks very much for tuning in, and I will catch you on the next one.